I want to welcome and thank you all for coming to the first public event the Harbor League is holding. I wanted to personally acknowledge Delegates Dwyer and McDonough. During the 2004 presidential elections, it became painfully clear to me just how one-sided our media can be. And even when they do discuss the conservative points of view, it is done in a cursory manner. And to be honest with you, at times I find, nothing personal, I find Fox News does not necessarily give the conservative side its due. Very often the reporting is predictable and watered down. I felt that in Baltimore, or for that matter, the Maryland area, is missing a venue where where liberty-minded people can come have conversations free from their left-of-center surroundings. I belong to a number of different organizations and think tanks in D.C. and New York, but found that there are few, if any, in the Baltimore area. So I got together with a few other professionals to found the Harbor League, so people with conservative political views can have a place to come for monthly roundtables, speakers, and events. James Madison once said, "It has been said that all government is an evil. It would be more proper to say that the necessity of any government is a misfortune. This necessity, however, exists, and the problem to be solved is not what form of government is perfect, but which form is least imperfect." With that in mind, the Harbor League philosophy is what I like to call practical politics. In a perfect world, America, as well as other nations, would live with the Jeffersonian philosophy, which combines an appreciation for entrepreneurship, a free market system, lower taxes, and respect for civil liberties, and skepticism about the benefits of both the welfare state and foreign military adventurism. However, in today's complex society, we do unfortunately have a sizable government. Through speakers' roundtables and other events throughout the year, the Harbor League intends to explore political thoughts of the best of political philosophy, including Jefferson, Madison, Hamilton, and Burke, as well as provocative contemporary political philosophers like Irving Kristol, Donald Kagan, Bill Bennett, and others. With topics like economic issues, from tax reform, should we have a flat tax or maybe a straight sales tax, or Social Security and private accounts, to charter schools and other issues like separation of church and state. The idea is to have an organization that will have events that will appeal to everyone with right-of-center political viewpoints. The Harbor League is non-sectarian and non-partisan. There are a number of other similar organizations in New York, like the Fabiani Society or the Smith Family Foundation monthly debates. And in D.C., there are many. But after talking to some people, including Ramesh Ponnur of the National Review and Herb London, the president of the Hudson Institute, I felt the need was real. Before I introduce our guest, I just want to thank a few people who made this event happen. First of all, before anything, I want to thank my wife Aviva, who put up with me over the past few weeks while I have worked on this endeavor. Alan and Fran Gold, who have yet to come, they'll be here somewhere in Delaware, who in the past 2 months put up with my 3 daily phone calls and were my sounding boards during the creation of the Harbor League. And to Tom and Rosaline Bernier, 2 people who worked tirelessly to see this event come to fruition, and to Jerry Gold, whom, without his vast list of contacts, the Harbor League would never have happened. Thank you. With that said, I'm pleased to introduce one of today's most provocative political writers, Michelle Malkin. Michelle, the author of her new book, Unhinged, Exposing Liberals Gone Wild, began her career in newspaper journalism more than a decade ago as an editorial writer, columnist for the Los Angeles Daily News. She continued at the Seattle Times in 1996, where for 3 years her column, now syndicated, appears in nearly 100 newspapers. Actually, I'm sorry, more than 100 newspapers nationwide, including the New York Post, Dallas Morning News, Washington Times. Her column also appears in numerous online outlets such as thetownhall.com, and her blog MichelleMalkin.com, which I highly recommend, has more than 100,000 daily visitors. Ms. Malkin is a Fox News contributor and has written 2 other books, Invasion, How America Still Welcomes Terrorists, Criminals, and Other Foreign Menaces to Our Shores, and In Defense of Internment, The Case for Making Racial Profiling in World War II and the War on Terror. Both books made the New York Times bestseller list. Following her remarks, Ms. Malkin has agreed to take some questions, and her book will be available for purchase, and she has agreed to sign some books. Without further ado, Ms. Malkin.
Thank you, Ellie, and thanks to everyone who has made this possible. It's an honor for me to be here tonight, a pleasure to be among friends in the bluest of the blue parts of the state here. I've just come off a sort of whirlwind campus book tour. I was at Cornell University the other day, Western Michigan University yesterday, and I'll be heading down to Georgetown University next week. So a little bit of rough sailing, and again, another reason why it's such a nice respite to be here tonight. And I'm doing something a little bit different. My last 2 books not only had hugely long subtitles, but they were, of course, very heavy-duty and serious tomes. And I let my hair down a little bit with this book. I had a lot of fun with it, even though this is just as heavily researched and has as serious undertones as the other 2. But I'm going to take you on a journey into the deep, dark cesspools of the American left. And for all of the conservatives in the audience, you can consider this sort of an anthropological study of an alien, unhinged subspecies. If there are any liberals in the audience, if there are, this is a compassionate intervention for you. And I really do see the book as a way for the left to look into the mirror and confront the ugly reality that their party and the movement have become. So this book probes every corner of the modern left's natural habitats, from academia to the media to Hollywood to Washington. And I have to warn you that the language is a little bit risque, and there's a couple of edgy photos in here of the dozens and dozens that I've collected in my research. But I thought it was really important not to whitewash the kind of language and the kind of behavior that the unhinged left has engaged in over the last couple of years. And I think a lot of my colleagues in the mainstream media have participated in a kind of protectionism of some of these wild folks, and I'm not having it. Tonight, we're going to take a special look, a focused look at the anti-war left, from the peaceniks' paranoia and their Bush derangement syndrome to the movement's media enablers, oddball quirks, slanderous statements, and violent behavior. Don't question their patriotism, they say. Well, I'll report, and you decide. This face may look familiar to you. It's the face of one of the anti-war left's favorite and most popular speakers, and his name is Jimmy Massey. He's a former Marine staff sergeant who has been traveling across the country the last year trashing our troops. And the quote I highlighted above comes from a speech, a typical speech that he gave at Cornell University about alleged wartime atrocities committed by American women and men in uniform in Iraq. And he's made repeated claims of gunning down innocent children, callously ambushing peaceful Iraqi protesters, and so on, of course confirming every worst assumption of the American of liberal students, faculty members, and Bush haters everywhere. But Ron Harris, who's a reporter at the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, had a lengthy expose last week where he talked about how Massey's claims do not hold up to scrutiny. He has altered and embellished his stories over the past few years. There are few, if any, corroborating witnesses in many of the cases that he mentions, and the Marines have investigated all of his claims and come up empty. Significantly, there were two newspapers, the Modesto Bee and the Sacramento Bee, that had published lengthy interviews with Massey that acknowledged just last week that they did not vet his slanderous claims properly. Jimmy Massey's face is the face that the anti-war left wants you to see, and his tales are the tales that they want you to believe. But behind his fraudulent mask is a not-so-peaceful image. I did not take that on Halloween, unfortunately. This was an unhinged liberal gone wild that I captured at the Cindy Sheehan protest in Washington, D.C. in September. And you might consider him Jimmy Massey's alter ego. Mr. F. the War here was not alone. Anti-war liberals have taken a roller coaster plunge into political crack pottery, and it's not just Hollywood conspiracy mongers like Oliver Stone and Michael Moore. It's all walks of unhinged liberal life and all regions of the collective democratic brain. It's nice to see the Bush administration taking on the Bush lied lie, but this propaganda line, the Bush new lie, has yet to be challenged. According to the Washington Post, at the Democratic National Committee headquarters in Washington, D.C. in June 2005, activists at the DNC office handed out documents suggesting that Israel was behind the September 11, 2001 terrorist attacks. That's the other variation on this theme. And 4 years after thorough debunking of such baseless beliefs, the Democratic Party still encompasses countless screwballs who believe that the September 11th attacks were orchestrated by the Jews, that the war in Iraq was engineered by Halliburton, that the capture of Saddam Hussein was staged, and that the Bush administration has Osama bin Laden secretly stashed away somewhere. There was also the crackpot theory that Bush had secret plans for a draft, and that the 2004 election was rigged by voting machine manufacturer Diebold. And the list goes on and on. It's still unclear how the faked moon landing fits into all of this, but it's got to be there somewhere. There was a time when conservatives were tagged as possessing what the historian Richard Hofstadter called the paranoid style in American politics, a pathological state of mind that was marked by, quote, heated exaggeration, suspiciousness, and conspiratorial fantasy. And that condition, I think, after doing all of this research, is now a far more accurate description of the left than the right. In response to every tragedy or terrorist attack, they smell a Republican plot. In every closet, they see Karl Rove. And at every anti-war rally, invisible tinfoil hats are the must-have fashion accessory. And lest you think this was just one lone incident that I cherry-picked, here's another sign at a separate anti-war rally. And by the way, just this week, there was a Brigham Young University professor named Stephen Jones who made headlines for claiming that the Muslim terrorists were not responsible for the collapse of the World Trade Center. It was, he said, an inside job. And he concluded scientifically that it was caused by explosives planted in the Twin Towers. By whom and for what reason, he wouldn't say. Earlier this year, I spotted this very same banner at a World Can't Wait anarchist anti-Bushapalooza rally in New York City's Times Square. Again, another one. Getting a theme here. More. A student of Stephen Jones, no doubt. This smiling conspiracy monger blames the vice president. And this Bay Area sign holder blames President Bush. Which brings us to our next fine unhinged specimens. When the anti-war activists tire of wading into the paranoid fever swamps, they pull out the Nazi card to spice up their usual Bush bashing and troop bashing. And as I mentioned, Bush derangement syndrome, which was an apt phrase coined by the Washington Post columnist Charles Krauthammer, has really permeated the entire Democrat Party structure. And of course, Krauthammer defined this syndrome as the acute onset of paranoia in otherwise normal people in reaction to the policies, the presidency, and the very existence of George W. Bush. Let's look at some of these guys. Howard Dean's next intern, I think. And if you look real close, of course, there's that ubiquitous Bush lied poster in the background there. From San Francisco, of course. Feel the love. A model of anti-war civil discourse. And another classy protester. I have to research it, but I think this one got NEA funding. And I hear that this sign holder has a job waiting at CBS News. Typical example of liberal math. And lynch mobs, which are of course are acceptable to liberals if W's neck is in the noose. Another variation on the Bush equals Hitler theme. And I dearly hope that these costumed protesters aren't teaching your kids history classes. This guy needs to work on his swastikas. This one got the umlaut right. I wasn't able to get a photo of one guy who was trying to protest the fascists in the Bush administration, but held up a sign that said, "Fascists!" And lest you think that the Nazi card is simply played by kook professors and fringe extremists, of course you'll remember this one. This was Senator Dick Durbin, who played the Nazi card in the summer of 2005, waving an FBI email that alleged systemic torture at Guantanamo Bay. Durbin railed on the Senate floor, analogizing the troops at Gitmo to Nazis, Soviets in their gulags, or some other mad regime, Pol Pot or others, that had no concern for human beings. Thankfully, the veterans in this country did not stand for this kind of rhetoric, and the head of the VFW struck back this way. Our soldiers put the needs of others first, just like generations of Americans before them. To link such selflessness to three of the world's worst regimes is reprehensible. And I thought it was really important to include this episode in my book because I looked far and wide for examples of sane liberals who would stand up to this kind of crackpottery and over-the-top rhetoric. And in this case, there was one. It was Richard Daley, the mayor of Chicago, who publicly chastised Senator Dick Durbin. I think it was really the tipping point that caused Durbin to go back to the Senate floor and apologize. Now, of course, like a lot of liberal apologies, it was very weasel-worded, but there was a sorry buried in there. And of course, he did go on to blame the right-wing noise machine for misinterpreting his very clear and unambiguous words. But I think the intervention of a grown-up like Richard Daley is an important example of what the modern Democratic leadership should be doing. And as I say, I looked far and wide, and I really could count on the fingers of one hand the number of examples of exemplary behavior. Nice triptych here. One of the main criticisms of my book from a lot of the left who remain in denial is that I'm cherry-picking anecdotes and that the cases that I talk about are not representative of the Democrat Party. D. You will recall that Cynthia McKinney of Georgia is one of the worst peddlers of the Bush new theories. And I want to read to you one of her rants on left-wing Pacifica Radio. What did this administration know and when did it know it about the events of September 11th? Who else knew and why did they not warn the innocent people of New York who were needlessly murdered? What do they have to hide? What is undeniable is that corporations close to the administration have directly benefited from the increased defense spending arising from the aftermath of September 11th. In July 2005, Representative McKinney convened an 8-hour crackpot fest in which participants concluded that the Bush administration and Israel wanted the attacks to occur for power. Then we have Senator Ted Kennedy of Massachusetts, who railed that the case for war against Iraq was a quote-unquote fraud that President Bush, quote, made up in Texas, unquote, because it was, quote, going to be good politically. And of course we have, as head of the party, Democratic National Committee Chairman Howard Dean, the epitome of unhingedness, who went on radio airwaves here in the DC area, actually, floating conspiracy theories about Bush being tipped off to 9/11 by the Saudis. I included this guy because it is an example where Howard Dean had an opportunity to stand up to anti-war extremism and squandered it. This is Bruce Charles, and he was cited in Portland for disorderly conduct after he threw a shoe at former Pentagon advisor Richard Pearl during a debate between Pearl and Dean in February 2005. And the audience, in the supposedly civil Pacific Northwest, sat there and laughed as Charles shouted that Pearl was a mother effing liar. And as Charles was dragged away, the progressive and tolerant Portland liberals heckled, booed, and interrupted Pearl. Not once did Dean, freshly crowned back then as leader of the Party of Peace, Love, and Understanding, chastise the audience for its appalling abuse of Richard Pearl.
Whoa.
Yep, here's the unhinged left's idea of nonviolent protest in Washington, D.C., advocating the castration of Dick Cheney. Okay, if you have queasy stomachs, you might want to close your eyes here because we've got naked hatred of President Bush, literally. There is a concerted effort to impede military recruitment efforts across the country and zeroing in on college campuses. And a number of these radical groups have gotten a pass in the mainstream media. Organizing these disruptive efforts are groups like Code Pink, a far-left feminist outfit of Fidel Castro groupies who instruct their members how to form blockades at military recruitment centers, harass officers, stage quote-unquote die-ins, and fraudulently pose as military recruits in order to infiltrate meetings. There's the Ruckus Society, the infamous guerrilla group involved in the 1999 World Trade Organization riots in Seattle, and they're leading training camps to, quote, give youth the tools we need to stop the military invasion of our schools and our communities. And another prominent group in this effort is the Militant War Resisters League and the Marxist-Leninist-rooted Central Committee for Conscientious Objectors. This is a typical scene involving these anti-military recruitment activists. On the right is Jeff Dew. He's a military recruiter at Seattle Central Community College, and earlier this year he was ambushed by protesters who hurled bottled water bottles at him and hounded him off the campus. This was done with the approbation of the college administration. The college president said after this temper tantrum of the students, "I'm not prepared to go on a witch hunt. We did the best we could do in this, and I believe the students have learned something, and we're going to move forward." These bratty, brutish kids sure did learn something, that if they throw a tantrum, threaten soldiers, they will suffer no consequences. The administration backed down completely. Two of the anti-recruiter protesters crowed in the Socialist Worker Online. Here's another role model for the anti-war activists. Her name's Carol Lang. And last spring, on City College in New York campus, where she serves as a secretary, she reportedly assaulted a police officer trying to arrest unruly anti-war protesters. They charged her with second-degree assault, disorderly conduct, and obstructing governmental administration. These were some of her protégés, Justin Rodriguez and Nicholas Bergreen, who also each were charged with resisting arrest, disorderly conduct, and assaulting a police officer. Another pacifist, Brendan Walsh. He's going to spend the next 5 years in federal prison for throwing Molotov cocktails through the window of a local armed forces recruiting station in upstate New York. Rare example of accountability. And again, lest you think that this is just a few punks and extremists on campuses, this is the official statement of the 36th District Democrats in Seattle. Military recruitment during an illegal war is morally repellent. The 36th District Democrats declare solidarity with students against war, support their peaceful civic engagement, defend their right to object to military recruiting on their campus, applaud their efforts to organize affiliated groups on other college campuses. And of course, along similar lines, we just had in San Francisco the resolution that was passed earlier this month, echoing these themes and banning military recruitment. I talked about how my colleagues often whitewash the violent side of the anti-war movement, and the flip side of that is their slander of the troops. You all recall the Newsweek Lied, People Died episode from earlier this year, where they had a report relying on a single source alleging supposed Koran abuse at Guantanamo Bay. And although the story was retracted, the damage was done. This is a cartoon by Steve Benson of the Arizona Republic depicting the guards at Gitmo as pigs. This is a cartoon by David Horsey of the Seattle Post-Intelligencer depicting our troops at Gitmo as racist morons. I had to put this one in here because I think that the media's own leftover derangement about Vietnam, certainly, and their own Bush hatred manifested itself in how they covered and smeared the Swiftboat veterans. And this is a cartoon from Pat Oliphant, who obviously views veterans like Paul Galante, who suffered torture for his country during his 7 years as a POW in North Vietnam, as nothing more than one of a bunch of drunkards indulging in resume padding. Here's a familiar face. This is Eleanor Clift, of course, of Newsweek and the McLaughlin Group, who in August 2005 derided our volunteer troops as, quote, a mercenary army, unquote, simply because they receive government salaries and benefits. Perhaps we should start referring to Clift and her ilk as the mercenary media. On the left is Linda Foley, the president of the Newspaper Guild. On the right is Eason Jordan, the former top executive of CNN, both of whom echo a commonly held view among mainstream media journalists that our troops are guilty of deliberately targeting and killing journalists. The anti-war left argues that it supports the troops but opposes the war, and I have no doubt that there are sincere pacifists out there somewhere who do support our troops. But the movement is dominated by a far more menacing faction of activists who harbor nothing but ill will toward our men and women in uniform. At least we don't need to guess which side they're on. And again, this is a recurring theme. I wish this was a satire. I wish. This woman admires Hassan Akbar and cheerleads for Hassan Akbar. And if that name sounds vaguely familiar, it's because he was the soldier who was recently convicted of fragging fellow American troops as they slept in their tents. He did it, he said, in protest of what he called anti-Muslim policies. Again, this is not just some fringe lone view. Ward Churchill, the nuttiest professor, who smeared the victims of 9/11 as little Eichmanns, mused out loud about how, quote-unquote, principled anti-war activists could embrace the idea of soldiers murdering soldiers on the battlefield as an effective anti-war tactic. This was some of his thoughts from June 2005. Quote, "You cannot maintain a military projection of force in the field when your own troops are taking out the line officers who are directing them in combat. Conscientious objection removes a given piece of the cannon fodder from the fray. Fragging an officer has a much more impactful effect." They say they support our troops. Well, this is one of them. His name's Jason Gilson, and he is a now 24-year-old Marine who was injured in Iraq. Anti-war activists in Bainbridge Island, Washington, showed their support for Mr. Gilson by screaming at him at a 4th of July parade where he wore his medals and carried a pro-Bush sign. They screamed, "Baby killer," "murderer," and "liar." They made obscene gestures at this wounded Marine as he attended the parade with his family, and I received a letter from his mother that I want to read to you in part. "The reason for this mob-style degrading was simply because my son had chosen to proudly wear his military-awarded medals upon his blazer while holding a small sign that said, 'Veterans for President Bush.' Even one of the announcers in the parade mockingly singled out my son and said in a sarcastic voice over a loudspeaker, 'And what exactly are you a veteran of?' How shocked and saddened I was by the total lack of respect and decency I witnessed firsthand at this parade. I have to admit, when my family and I were asked to come and march in the parade, I felt a surge of pride and was greatly honored to be able to participate in such an event." Mrs. Gilson had also taken her 8, 11, and 13-year-old children with her to the parade. "Where have our morals, principles, and decency gone? I am heartsick, yet ever and more determined to stand up for what is right, for who will if we won't?" Oops. Hey. Wait a minute. for the skip there. Again, to emphasize that this isn't simply a few fruitcake liberals. It's also Democrat elected officials like Pete Stark, who left this message on the voice machine of an Iraq war veteran who disagreed with some of his anti-war policies. Instead of leaving him a civil note of disagreement, he cursed at him and said, "You think you're such a great goddamn hero." No apology to Sergeant Daniel Dow, who received that message, taped it, and had enough gumption to give the tape over to a local radio station in Northern California that played it. I had to put a Ted Rall quote in here, the widely published columnist and cartoonist who likened our troops to murderers for Halliburton. And again, I wish this one was a joke, but it's not. And lest you think the examples in my book are moldy and old, this was a scene from November 2nd of this year in San Francisco, where apparently the theme of the anti-war activists there is, we support the troops by trying to burn officers and hang American soldiers in effigy. Don't question their patriotism.
I question your citizenship.
It's about time we do that. The Democrats have long set the tone for bitter anti-military sentiment disguised as pacifism. From liberals in city government declaring nuclear-free zones to liberals banning military recruiters on college campuses and in public schools, to the spiteful yellow ribbon snatchers in your neighborhood. I didn't have any pictures of any of these, but I have included in my book true examples of folks who were literally driven crazy by the mere sight of yellow ribbons on the back of your car wrapped around trees. There was a woman named Linda Ragsdale in Carpinteria, California, who was so mad that her neighbors had put ribbons around trees in tribute to the troops that she pulled on her rollerblades and skated around town with a pair of scissors, chopping all the ribbons off the trees. These foul-mouthed malcontents call themselves the true patriots in this country. But the true patriots are the men and women buried here at Arlington National Cemetery who sacrificed their lives. Sacrificed their lives so anti-war extremists could spend their lives cursing war veterans, slandering active duty troops, indulging in Bush hatred, burning soldiers in effigy, impeding recruitment efforts, cheerleading Iraqi terrorists, and openly embracing the murder of American troops on the battlefield. To paraphrase Mrs. Gilson, if we don't question their patriotism, who will? Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Malkin has agreed to take some questions, so if there.
Yes. Well, first of all, I enjoyed your speech. I read your column, I read your town hall column every week and your blog every day.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Have you heard any status of Ward Churchill?
Actually, I was just on the radio with a pair of Denver talk show hosts who have been really instrumental in pushing the University of Colorado on their investigation. They've been dragging their heels. And the latest is that the administration had shifted the investigation to a new committee. They appointed some new people to it. And it turns out, thanks to these Denver talk show hosts, Kaplis and Silverman, that two of the people, it was stacked. Two of the people actually had longtime ties to Ward Churchill. One of them had sponsored him at a speech when he worked for another school. And thanks to the local uproar there in the last couple of weeks, they booted those folks out. But a lot of the investigation has been dropped on some of the key academic sins that he'd been charged with. I think the plagiarism charges have been dropped, and then they just let this whole issue of his lying about his Native American status just kind of slowly die on the vine. So the guy's gotten away with it, and he's made a very lucrative career out of smearing 9/11 victims and saying the kind of things that he's saying. I mean, he's got an incredibly booked and busy lecture schedule, and I wouldn't be surprised if some left-wing publishing company comes out with a new book authored by him. He's very busy and very happy.
I find it amazing that Democrats can defend Republicans or pretty much anybody, and it's okay, but Republicans say anything about somebody else, then it's a big to-do, and they demand an apology. And don't give it.
And that's right. Well, yeah, the Durbin example was a good example of that. And, that really helped. Those double standards really helped fuel the book, because it goes even well beyond just the anti-war aspect of it. I talk about liberal bigotry and liberal hatred. I have a whole chapter on that, which I titled "You Are One Sick Gook," which came from a typical hate mail that I got. And the denial of reality on the part of a lot of these critics just never ceases to amaze me. The response is always, "Oh, you just picked out a few of the worst ones, and why are you whining? And this is not representative. Oh, I can give you boxes and boxes of these emails." I had more hard time, culling them down for the book. I could do a whole encyclopedia set for this.
I'd just like to see one that doesn't fall into that category.
Yeah.
I'd like your opinion as an outsider. Those of us here in Maryland are familiar with a slam that went bad, and that was the Oreo cookies against Mike Steele. And now you have the Chicago Tribune and the Sun Papers. Chicago Tribune owns the Sun Papers, denying that it ever happened. And they've denied another number of other slurs that have happened. Your comment on the fact that they will deny, that denial.
One of the reasons I think that such a significant portion of the left is so unhinged is because they have lost this monopoly on how news and information is disseminated in this country. And with talk radio and with the internet and the blogosphere and Fox News when they're at their best, the message will get out there and the truth will get out there. And I think that really does upset their little tidy apple cart to a huge extent. And so, they're trying to deny the story. And we saw Howard Dean over the weekend when he was queried about it, Howard the Coward, about it, and he basically insinuated that it was all made up, because Tim Russert had asked him on Meet the Press, well, what about these charges of Democrats calling him an Uncle Tom, even though it's right there all in black and white, it's all documented, and they're going to say that we fabricated. I call that projection, because look at how many things are manufactured and fabricated by the left that they get away with. And the solution to that is to, my book, hopefully, which is just to compile hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of unassailable examples that they simply cannot deny.
But the fact that it's the Chicago Tribune, a national media, denying what we all know to be true.
Right. In that case, I guess it falls on the lieutenant governor's shoulders to go out there and fight mano a mano and rebut them.
Michelle, I like to say I was in the audience and I saw them hit the stage. I was there. I was no more than 50 feet from the stage. It is true. It's a fact. I saw two roll up on the stage at the feet of the lieutenant governor. I was there with my wife and some friends. Number two is, how do you deal on Hannity and Combs? I'd like to know, how is he off camera?
Which one?
I'm not Hannity. You know how he is. How do you deal with him? Is he that blind? Is see that depth? I mean, he's pathetic sometimes on his answers and defending his side. Can you tell us what your take is?
Honestly, Alan Combs is one of the nicest people that I have met in this business. He's a very decent guy. And unlike a lot of cynical liberal pundits, he does believe what he's saying. And I guess you got to give him credit for that, you know. He's not cynical. He's just sorely misguided.
Dr. Kaplan.
What is the nature of the message that you present to college students? I'm sure it isn't like this evening.
Actually,
It is?
it is.
Well then, how do they respond to it? And how do you respond to resistance?
The first response from many of the leftists on campuses is that it's not fair, and that it's not fair to tar the entire Democrat Party leadership with unhingedness because I'm just pointing out some fringe people on anti-war rallies. But when you start ticking off, you know, Cynthia McKinney's statements and Ted Kennedy's and Howard Dean's and Pete Stark's and Jim. Now that was a Freudian slip. Baghdad Jim McDermott. They can't argue with that, and so they're paralyzed in a sense, and that's exactly where I want them to be. And I think that this is, you know, this presentation anyway is a real slap in the face. The other theme that I have been hammering on was this liberal hatred and liberal bigotry and liberal racism. And ever since I was in college, and I went to Oberlin College, you know, just the fever swamp of the unhinged in the middle of Ohio, I've been confronted with this accusation that somehow if you're a minority Republican or a minority conservative, that you are de facto a traitor to your race or ethnicity, that you cannot come to the independent conclusion that free market principles and social conservative values are best for your family and best for this country. That's all they have is these ad hominem smears. And then when you turn around and repeat what they're saying to you, that you're an Oreo, that you're a banana, that you're a coconut. Thank God I haven't had any coconuts hurled at me. That would hurt.
Cookies are little.
Yeah, that's right. The bananas would be soft, though. I think that's exactly the thing that's needed, is that kind of intervention, because they live in la-la land, and they're coddled by these administrators and faculty members who haven't grown up themselves. And, you know, all I can do is try and hope that my children, you know, never get to that state. But I think confronting them with their ugliness is the best route to go, and that's why I wrote the book.
And they don't challenge.
No, I mean, they sat on their hands, and I think the other thing that's really important is when they do the moral equivalence thing. You do it too, the right is just as bad. And, you know, one of my quick answers is, tell me the last time a liberal speaker on a college campus had something hurled at them. Because on the right, there's Bill Kristol and Ann Coulter and Richard Pearl and Pat Buchanan. And they can't point to any examples. And that is that kind of disparity that they keep denying and that we have to keep pointing out. I mean, and you never see these kind of images in the mainstream media. They won't be on the front pages of the New York Times or the Washington Post. You know what's going to be on the front page of the Washington Post over Thanksgiving week? Cindy Sheehan, who's going back down to Crawford, Texas to have another one of her hate fests. And they, you know, coddle that and they perpetuate that. And I think, you know, fighting in the alternate media is the best we can do.
My boyfriend is currently serving in Iraq, and he was actually part of that unit that was targeted by fragging.
Oh, wow.
But he wasn't there.
He wasn't in the tent.
But where, I guess on the internet, can you find more information, like the good stuff from Iraq? Because I really like Michael Yan.
Michael Yan's got a great blog, embedded freelance reporter. all of them, the military blogs, just provide excellent coverage. And there's actually a site that aggregates them all. It's called millblogs.com, and it links to a bunch of them. But some of my favorites are, there's someone named Black Five, who has a great one, Mudville Gazette, who runs a great military blog with his wife. And, just go to those couple places and you'll be able to just click through. And it's amazing how much the blogosphere has opened up, just my eyes and my world. And I think it's really an underappreciated phenomenon in terms of just military coverage alone and the kind of on-the-ground reporting that you get. And I'll give you an example of that. Do you remember when Andrea Mitchell and the rest of the mainstream media went on the snit fit because they said that there was this exchange between President Bush and some soldiers giving an update in Iraq was totally staged, right? And simply because these troops were just rehearsing and just passing around the microphone and saying who was going to go next and where. Not a single word was fed to these people, and it's that kind of condescending attitude in the mainstream media that is really just a morale breaker for the troops. Anyway, thanks to the blogosphere, a couple of these men who had been in the audience were able to answer back. And I linked to a couple of their blogs, and they had long essays about showing their support for President Bush and the war. And you know what the mainstream media did? They turned around and tried to attack them the same way they attacked the Swift Boat veterans by saying, oh, these people have been saying pro-Bush things for the past 3 years. That's because they support the war, and no, they weren't brainwashed. Anyway, thanks for your boyfriend's service.
Question, following up on what you said and the other question back here. Michael Steele had the Oreo cookies and all the name calling from his fellow blacks. Do you get a lot of grief from Asians? Or do they basically support you because they think properly?
Well, that's a good question. And first of all, this whole idea of some, cohesive group of Asians is just so ridiculous. Fourth and fifth generation Japanese Americans from California have very little in common with, first generation Vietnamese and second generation Filipinos from New Jersey. And it's always funny. I'll never forget one of my first experiences at Oberlin was being forced to stay in an ethnic dorm called Asia House, simply because my last name sounded like music. My maiden name was Magla Lang. So they automatically assumed that I'd want to be with, other Asians, and that simply because we all had black hair and black eyes that we all believed the same things. I was so lonely there. They should have put me in the dorm where the football players were. Such as they were at Oberlin College. I don't think they won a game in my 4 years. But, in any case, a lot of Asian Americans in the media, and there's these ethnic journalist societies, the Asian American Journalist Association, basically treat me like a pariah, especially when my second book came out on profiling and during the World War II and the War on Terror. And when I was at the University of California at Berkeley, there was this strange contingent of Filipinos who were not protesting any of the substance of the book, but were protesting my mere existence as somebody who was of Filipino descent and conservative. And after my speech, during which 300 other students screamed the whole time, shame, 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 as they banged on the door, this other contingent followed me, trailed me all the way from the lecture hall to my car, screaming some folk song, revolutionary folk song in Tagalog. So it just goes back to that theme of this, somehow being a traitor or a sellout simply for subscribing to to Republican values and conservative principles. But I pinpoint that as another reason why the left has gotten so unhinged too, because more and more minority conservatives are becoming vocal and visible. And all you have to do is look at not just the attacks on Michael Steele, but on Condoleezza Rice, which are just vicious. And I have a whole subsection in that chapter, You Are Once at Gook, where I talk about what she's gone through. And my stuff looks like, play school compared to, and again, it's not just some whacknut, at some homeless shelter in San Francisco drawing ugly pictures of her. It's Gary Trudeau deriding her as brown sugar, and Ted Rall drawing her as, it was Jeff Danziger drawing her as Prissy from Gone with the Wind, and Pat Oliphant drawing her as a buck-toothed parrot sitting on George Bush's shoulder. And these people get away with it, and I'm just sick of it, just sick.
Do you think the recent riots in France will have any impact whatsoever on the immigration policies of the Bush administration?
No. September 11th didn't have any impact on the Bush's policies on immigration. And, that's 3,000 people that died here. I don't know. I mean, now I'm getting off message. Darn you! But, talk about... Yeah, I know. Talk about denial of reality. My first book was dedicated to just this basic thesis that immigration policy should be treated as a national security issue first and foremost. And we have the Bush administration and the Wall Street Journal editorial page continuing to live in la-la land, thinking that yet another amnesty is going to solve the problem, when every time we've granted amnesty, large or small, it has had one result: more illegal immigration. And there is sort of a minor revolt now among some House Republicans led by people like Tom Tancredo. But you get this knee-jerk reaction on the part of a lot of more libertarian, open borders types that people like Tom Tancredo or me are motivated simply by xenophobia or racism, and nothing could be further from the truth. What we see is, people like, my family in the Philippines, many of whom have been waiting for years and years and years, and you can hear this from, people in your neighborhood, in your community, everywhere, the same story of people waiting in line to do it the right way, and it's taking longer and longer to get visas issued for them, while all of these magnets are attracting people to come across the southern border, and we give them everything. Even Montgomery County, where I live, Montgomery County, Maryland, which is like a lot of places in Maryland and the rest of the country, a de facto sanctuary state. From lack of law enforcement to giving them driver's licenses and discounted college tuition, the whole panoply. And even though we hear noises from the Bush administration that they're going to beef up the border and now they're entertaining the idea of extending a fence, you could put one Border Patrol agent every inch along the southern and northern borders, and it's not going to matter if you're not enforcing the law in the interior. And I've talked to a lot of people at the Department of Homeland Security, rank and file and management, who understand that problem. It's not a problem of money. It's not a problem of other sorts of physical resources. It's a matter of will, and of course it's a political mess. And so that's my long answer. No, the riots are not going to do anything to wake us up. Another September 11th type attack that kills 10 or 15 or 20 times more people, maybe that'll do it.
Let me just interject once. I have a question of my own.
Okay.
And that is, how many people have you Malkinized over your trips to colleges? And with the pictures, we know the pictures actually rile up the left. But how many of them actually got disgusted, or have you seen, and actually gotten disgusted with the pictures that you show?
Actually, I was at Western Michigan University yesterday, and that's where Pat Buchanan had salad dressing tossed at him last spring. And there were 3 or 4 students that came up to me and said that they were, moderates or, centrists. And actually, because I asked in the audience, I said, could anybody just say without saying but, that this is disgusting, that this is, beyond the pale? And, there were 3 or 4 hands that went up. And that's astonishing, because that's never happened to me before. So slowly, and I wouldn't, there's only 2 people in this world that I want to make sure are Malkinized, and that's my 5-year-old daughter and my 2-year-old son.
Thank you very much. Before we go, I just wanted to repeat one part of my introduction, and that was the thank you to Alan and Fran Gold, who have since arrived. And without their help, it would not have this evening would not have happened. Also, I wanted to just ask for everybody's patience for another 2 minutes, not even, just Alan Gold wants to say a few words.
Good evening, and thank you all for coming. What we're trying to do here is have speakers like this almost every month on a variety of topics from a conservative viewpoint. And we need your help to continue to do it. It's a viewpoint that is not being given a chance by the mainstream media and even by academia. So it's important for the Harbor Week to be successful. And we're not going to limit ourselves to one topic. We're going to have conservative points of view on education, on Social Security, on every conceivable public policy issue. And we're going to try to go out of the box and give you a wide range of conservative viewpoints, because not all conservatives agree about how to approach these situations. And we hope that you look at the membership material, and we hope that you join us. Thank you.
One final thing before we two final things before we go to the reception, and Ms. Malkin will be signing her books. We have a drawing that was collected at the beginning for the Ronald Reagan Youth Scholarship Fund, and Michelle Malkin has agreed to pick the winner of that.
And $51 is the take.
$51.
192647. 192647. Woohoo!
Congratulations.
And great football team, just so you know. Love you guys.
We do have one more thing, and that is the drawing for a copy of Michelle's book, which, you'll pardon me, but the cards are outside, and they're being brought in as we speak by under-armed guard Tom Bernier. Oh. Now your card's not in here, is it? Martin Lowe. So we will give you the book by the signing. You'll talk to Michelle. And without further ado, our reception.